Bonjour, je m'appelle Janet Hallowell. Je suis membre du conseil d'administration du réseau canadien des centres de données de recherche et profondément impliqué dans leur formation il y a 20 ans. Il me fait plaisir de souhaiter la bienvenue à tous nos participants canadiens et internationaux. Nous sommes très heureux que vous soyez des nôtres pour cette conférence virtuelle du RCCDR, présentée en partenariat avec Statistique Canada. Today, the spotlight is on immigration and settlement. We're delighted to have 4 outstanding panelists. The first 3 will share their experience of how the CRDCN is advancing their research, after which we turn to a senior government official who has deep practical experience with building the evidence base to inform policy. They will each discuss their aspirations for future data, research, and/or policy development as contributions to this week's series. Looking back and looking forward, the impact of CRDCN research. Each of our panelists will present opening remarks of 6 to 7 minutes. As this portion of the session has been pre-recorded, we invite you to submit your questions as you listen to each speaker. We'll get to as many of those questions as possible in the live Q&A that will follow. So our first speaker is Yoko Yoshida, Associate Professor of Sociology at Western University, also affiliated with Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie. Her research focuses on immigration and social inequality. Over to you, Yoko.
Thank you, Janet. It is very incredible to realize that this is 20th anniversary for CRDCN because RDC was there when I was doing my PhD, and my work afterwards heavily relied on the RDC data. My career path is almost inconceivable without RDC. So today I'm very delighted to say a few words reflecting on my research and looking ahead. So my research with the RDC data in the area of immigration, well, earlier on, I used the WEST, or Workplace and Employee Survey, to examine the post-hiring experience of immigrants in Canadian firms and how does that affect the earnings disparity. Also, I looked at a couple of issues by using LSIC, the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, the contribution of non-economic immigrants to Canada, as well as looking at the secondary migration patterns of immigrants who landed in Atlantic Canada. And just looking back, this research has been shaped by public concerns and policy debates of that time. And these data sets really gave me the opportunity to engage with ongoing debate through my research. But to me, a big game changer in my research came with the access to the administrative record, namely the IMDb Longitudinal Immigration Database. So today I'd like to focus on 2 points of game changing. And the IMDb, because of its shared volume, now we can examine the trends of immigrants in the small areas as well as the specific groups. Well, this was a big breakthrough for studying immigrants' trend in Atlantic Canada. With LSIC, for example, we could only make a robust estimate at the Atlantic region as a whole. We could not even generate the trends even at the provincial level. And so really, it really didn't make a cut to initiate the meaningful conversation with local stakeholders. So now with the IMDb, for the first time, we as researchers got an access to the data which we can produce for relevant information for policy. So how many immigrants come to specific regions? How many of them are refugees? What are the economic and other outcomes of immigrants in specific regions? These are crucial information for policy planning. And also for us researchers, it was very huge because we always heard about the stories that signal the uniqueness of Atlantic region, but we really did not have any data source to validate them. So the IMDb really opened up the opportunity to highlight the unique local trends, and which I'd like to think that eventually contributed to the shift in the policy planning. So such as AIPP was designed to tailor the local specific needs and trends as compared to one-size-fits-all type of immigration policy based on the trends often observed in the larger population centers. Now, the fact that we can now generate the granular data sparked the interest amongst non-academic partners, and that really changed the way that I do research. So for instance, one of my early projects with IMDb brought in partners from service provider organizations, like the Immigrant Service Association of Nova Scotia, and together we examined the immigration trends specific to the region, and then we also engaged with the exchange findings with the provincial stakeholders as well. And more recently, the CIRC, Child Youth Refugee Research Coalition, was launched under the SHARC's partnership grant, and that brought in the governmental and non-governmental partners across Canada. So what is so special about this experience is to realize that there is so much potential that we can contribute to each other. So this SPOs, or service settlement sectors, provide service and interact with immigrants on a daily basis. So they have so rich information about what's going on. And so their knowledge was very helpful for us researchers to design our research, interpret our findings, and disseminate. On the other hand, we as a researcher have expertise to produce research which speaks to the evidence base for for their program planning as well as decision making, such as allocating resources. So for me, like IMDb not only shifted what I studied on, but also expanded my research network. So now, based on this experience, where we're going. So here is the project that I'm currently developing, which is to transform the university classroom into a space where research is being produced. So changing the space of learning based on the reading and thinking into the space of learning through doing and producing. So this is something that I started last year at Dalhousie University and now trying to replicate at the university, at Western University. So in a nutshell, at the beginning of this course, community partners are invited to speak about the nature of their work. And I asked them to lay out the research gaps that they want to see filled. Based on that, students were tasked to come up with the researchable questions and generate evidences from the existing literature and published data, and write the reports and present back to the partners at the end of the course. Essentially, this model transformed the classroom into the incubator of the research, so to speak. Now, working over the years with admin data and working with non-academic partners, it became very clear to me that it takes time to develop skills and handle complex admin records. And two, there are so much demands amongst the community partners for this data. So my idea is, why not bring in this incubator model into the research data center? So through this model, students can gain skill sets which can be used for their own project in the future, let alone transferable skill sets for the future workplace. And community partners could also benefit the data aggregates and reports that students produce in the course, and that could even lead to finding the potential hire for their organization in the future. And of course, researchers, of course, we can develop papers working with the students, and the universities too these days tend to prize experiential learning. So these are the kind of things that I'd like to see happening in the future, and then hopefully we can get over the pandemic conditions so that we can implement this. So thank you very much, and happy anniversary, CRDCN. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Yoko. You've shone a spotlight, a really interesting spotlight on the vital role of partnerships, collaboration in just addressing issues of immigration, but also in trying to increase the impact, the translation of research and the role of local stakeholders. And I'm intrigued by your concept of an incubator. The incubator, obviously, that involves students, but it would be fun to really explore further in the Q&A session how CRDCN can really facilitate this effectively on a sort of national scale, the incubator that involves students, but also the local stakeholders. So again, thank you, Yoko, for kicking off this session. And now on to our next speaker, and that's Tony Fang. He is the Stephen Jarolowski Chair in Cultural and Economic Transformation at Memorial University. Tony is also an adjunct professor at U of T and holds the J. Robert Baster Faculty Fellowship at Rutgers University. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Janet. It's my great pleasure and indeed an honor to be here, celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Canadian RDC network. Actually, my role in this network started in 2001, a third year into my doctoral program in Industrialization Human Resource Management at University of Toronto. I actually started position as research economist at the Stats Canada. I work with the analyst, in RDC across the country and to provide data services to more than 90 researchers across country, but also around the world, including I think a couple panelists here as well for the workplace employee survey. Of course, myself also as a migration scholar benefited enormously from the network, from the access to a number of exciting waves of longitudinal survey, the SLID survey, labor income dynamics, the workplace employee survey, and the census, of course, also the youth in transition survey. And also through this experience, I have to be able to build research collaborations, with colleagues around the world, and also through my own teaching experience from University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, to York University in Toronto, then to Wharton School of Business, Philadelphia in the United States, and more recently at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. So basically, as an immigrant myself, I can appreciate important socioeconomic impacts of immigration to this wonderful country. And indeed, through my experience in various different countries, Australia, United States, China, and Canada, I think Canada definitely is the best place for immigrants and refugee international students. I think so because number one is because in Canada we have very innovative immigration policy and programs, starting from the point system in 1961, the first one, skilled immigration program in the world. And as recently we have the express entry, we have the provincial nominee program, and in Atlantic Canada we have the AIPP, Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. So the second is that actually policymakers at all levels of government, the federal, provincial, municipal government, have made important decisions following the so-called evidence-based decision-making process based on largely, the census data and also a lot of important micro-level data I just mentioned earlier. So this certainly been actually confirmed by recent report by OECD, which shows that Canada is the number one in terms of settlement and integration policies and programs in the world. So myself, I started immigration research about 10 years ago when I was at York University, received the research funding from SSHRC, Metropolis immigration research funding. This is also joint funded by, IRCC at that time, and to examine the socio-economic impact of large-scale immigration to Canada, as measured by various important outcomes like population growth, productivity, government fiscal balances, and so on and so forth, by using the census data. And this research was published by British Journal of Industrial Relations and received quite wide attention from the policy shop, but also the general public and the media and so on and so forth. And then after that, I move on to the Monash University in Australia. I have started some comparative analysis of immigration policies and programs in various countries, notably US, Canada, and Australia. Okay, and in 2015, I actually accepted position as Stephen Jaroslawski Chair of Cultural Economic Transformation at Memorial University, where I also received my master's degree. And this program was generally funded by, Business Tycom. And, Mr. Jaroslawski himself is actually a refugee from Germany in the 1940s, fleeing the oppression of Nazis. And he generally donated more than 20 research chairs. And, I was very fortunate to receive this chair dedicated to demographic and immigration research, especially for Atlantic Canada, but also for Canada as a whole. And so recently my research focused on the employer attitudes towards hiring newcomers and international students, how that would affect long-term integration and also retention of immigrants in Atlantic region and in Canada as well. So, and I've done so through using the RDC data, but also we have conducted, our own employer survey and also our field studies in Newfoundland, Labrador, but also in Atlantic region. So I think now is probably more important than ever to conduct more high quality empirical study to demonstrate the social economic benefits of immigration to Canada, given the current global pandemic, which hit the newcomers hardest, but also the anti-immigration sentiment in certain part of words and even some kind of Cold War rhetoric. So I think, as migration scholar, who benefit enormously from the access RDC data, but we can actually give back, right, to Canada, to RDCs by actually training the next generation of migration scholars through teaching, research, and policy engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. And I'm fascinated by the extent to which your current position is in fact funded by an immigrant and the linkage of your own interests. And when you've spoken to the benefit of what seem to be fairly far-sighted Canadian immigration policies that were evidence-based, and the need, particularly in post-COVID times, to pursue that even further. Just building that evidence base for how we move forward to ensure that social fabric of Canada continues to evolve. So again, many thanks. I know we've made a lot of progress in terms of access to some of the business data and things like that over the years. Lots of distance to go yet, I know. Our third speaker is Anna Ferrer, and she's Professor of Economics at the University of Waterloo and Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts. Her research focuses on labor markets, education, immigration, and family economics. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Janet. Hello. I am very happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So, as you may not know, I started my Canadian career in labor economics in the late 90s. So I know firsthand the difference that the RDC has done in Canadian research landscape. And I want to start this chat with a trip down memory lane for the benefit of the younger audiences that may not know. And something has happened here that has deleted my script. So before the RDC, research with restricted data typically required having a contact in Ottawa. A young researcher, such as myself, would try to access through a supervisor or a senior faculty member in the university so that he could get access. And for researchers that live elsewhere, it also required considerable financial support because it was expensive to go and live in Ottawa for a while to get access to data. So of course, there were some alternatives. You could use remote access, but that was not so generally available, and it was very painful and slow. And there was also public access data. The lack of access introduces several limitations in terms of what could be, what questions were asked. First, the scope of research was limited, as I said, because some questions were asked, only some questions were asked. And most importantly, training new researchers was expensive and inefficient. And it overall resulted in lost opportunities to understand social issues because it introduced inequalities in the research community. Young researchers from a smaller university often didn't have access to quantitative research. So some questions could not be explored for lack of capacity. In the area of immigration, at this time, there were some developments that made obvious the need for a better data access structure. There were studies coming up in the 1990s that documented the decline in immigrant earnings, and understanding why this was happening was very important because Canadian immigration policy was betting on immigration to fuel growth. There were a series of studies in the early 2000s that started to uncover this, but they were all using privileged information and restricted access. So it was very, very obvious that it was needed even more researchers that could handle the access, the data that was becoming available, new data as well. And there was need for new information and for new data sets. Visa information, longitudinal records, retrospective information, detailed geographical information, all these things were obviously necessary to progress in what we know about immigration. Today, with the RDC network, just by increasing the use of the restricted census, just by that, because it has better information, we have improved our understanding of the difference between the native born and the immigrant along many dimensions, such as education, employment, fertility, occupational skills, living arrangement, many, many things that we now understand that we couldn't get up before. Also, having further data availability with the new data sets like the WES and the LSIC, the IMBD that have been mentioned before, we could focus on visa categories that are essential to evaluate admission policies. We could get longitudinal studies looking at how to get in and out of employment, how people get in and out of poverty, what are the retention rates in CMAs or some areas in Canada that are essential to evaluate settlement policies. We also were able to look at other measures of immigration that improve our understanding of this process. We could look at how immigrants access the housing markets, what is the distance between pre and post-immigration labor market outcomes, and many other things. And finally, we could also look at specialized populations that are of interest for a particular reason. And you can all recognize the research in these areas and how it has shaped Canadian immigration policy. The Canadian Experience Class, this presently, the provincial nominee programs, they are all policy programs that have evolved from this area. So to summarize, I think that beyond generating much needed support in much needed research in immigration, the RDC has two main accomplishments. It has been the great equalizer and diversity champion in Canadian research because it has increased access to a broad network of researchers that didn't have access before. It has also trained a new generation of social scientists through access to complex data of social and political relevance. And also because of many other initiatives such as access to workshops and seminars and opportunities to network that are available through the RDC. In terms of looking at the future, I think that for the immediate future, I'm sure the RDC wants to continue addressing data accessibility challenges and make it even easier and more comprehensive access for everybody, and also continue to provide new data sources and new linkages that can improve our knowledge in other areas, particularly in the area of business and how immigrants are related to business, either because they are businessmen or because they work for other people. So all that side is a little bit iffy at the moment, and we need better data in that area. In the long run, I will just bring up two issues that I think may require or may be good to talk about. One is regards data collection. So there has been an increase in the propensity to use administrative data, which is great, but that often lacks socio-demographic characteristics and markers. There has also been private initiatives to collect data, which are also good, but if these trends continue, this may call for further discussion about whether we have the right data and whether this data is equally accessible for everybody. And the other point, and here I concur with Job as well, that there has to be a way to foster further collaboration, particularly among younger researchers. So I love this idea of creating these incubators that has been mentioned before, and I look forward to hear many more new ideas. Thank you.
So thank you, Anna. That was a delightful trip through memory lane, and just looking at how the insights from the RDC microdata sets have evolved over the years. And yeah, I guess it's sort of the increasing access, complexity, and relevance that's occurred. Just understanding patterns and processes of economic and social integration, the settlement, that is so important. So, you know, it's interesting. As you spoke, I was struck by the diversity of the issues that play into our understanding of immigration, of how immigrants integrate into Canadian society. And it just recognizing just how diverse are the data sets that we need going forward. Then there's clearly an appetite for richer, deeper data. So thank you again, Anna. And now we'll go on to our final speaker, Ima. Et il me fait plaisir d'inviter Ima Okuni à prendre la parole. Elle est dirigeante principale des données à Emploi et Développement social Canada et nouveau membre du conseil d'administration du réseau canadien des centres de données de recherche. Ima. À vous.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you for that kind introduction. And congratulations, CRDCN, on your 20th anniversary. That is a huge achievement. And thank you, Yoko, thank you, Tony and Anna, for your presentations. I found it very insightful. I was thinking as you went through your presentations, next year marks the 50th anniversary that my parents decided to make the journey to come to Canada to do their studies. My father did his PhD in Carleton University and went through the immigration story. And one of the reasons I was born in Ottawa was because my parents made that decision. So, I mean, in terms of building the evidence and the immigration story, I think it is a very critical issue as we go forward, as we look back. Because it's very important on the policy side for us to understand the context of some of the policy decisions that were made in the past and decisions we have to make forward in the future as we look at how to really grow a strong Canada and a strong society. So we talked about some of the challenges around access to data, access to some variables, and in terms of the future of evidence-based, the contextualization of data will become even more important. The transparency around data will become more important. And the speed at which we can really get to data and make serious policy decisions will become way more important. We saw this clearly with COVID-19, whereas people in the policy world, we had to make policy and make tweaks and serve Canadians and serve immigrants all across this country. And one of the challenges we faced was having access to granular data quickly to be able to inform policy and tweak our programs in order to meet and reach all people all across this country. So going forward, one of the things I will really peg as something we need to work together on is how we can really shorten the time between research, analysis, and really getting that evidence into the hands of policymakers to really support us in how we can move forward and action and implement programs and policies to make sure that we're responding to some of the burning questions we have at the time we have an event or a crisis, or at the time we're doing our policy design. The other thing I wanted to really focus on again was the issue around trust. So I think, Tony, you mentioned some of this, the changes we're seeing in our world in terms of the thought around our society and the stories we see coming out in the media, all around the internet, some of the news, researching and getting that research out quickly in terms of the evidence, the evidence base, and some of the findings will be critical in terms of immigration, to talk about the value of immigration, the impact of immigration, the challenges to integration, and some of the things we could do to make it easier for immigrants to integrate when they come into this country. So, I mean, lots of work to do there, lots of opportunities, and in terms of the future, collaborative opportunities in terms of working with researchers, working with policymakers, and probably sitting together and really seeing how we can map out quick, active things to do. One of the things I liked was the conversation, Yoko, you raised in terms of an incubator. I really like that idea because one of the challenges that I have observed in the last few years is some of the rigor that's needed in terms of bringing in data, doing quick research, and be able to get it out quickly in terms of contextualizing the reality of policy, the reality of the data, and then also ensuring we still have that rigor that's needed in terms of really intelligently informing policy and decision making. So I like the idea of capturing this really early at the student level, and by the time they get into the workforce, you have people with the skills to really support some of that quick decision making. So all in all, I am really looking forward to continuing the journey of building the evidence base with CRDCN, with Statistics Canada, with academics, with the provinces, with people all across this research world and data world. And I'm excited because there's a lot to come. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to you, Janet.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I'm delighted to have you around the board table at CRDCN. I mean, this is fascinating to hear your insights as a sort of facilitator between the data and the policy analysis and the decision making. And I think the 4 words that you used that resonated so clearly with me: contextualization, transparency, speed, and trust. That's a pretty big agenda, but if we can move down that path, I think we'll be doing superbly well. So again, thank you, Emma. Very valuable insights. So this concludes the pre-recorded portion of the Spotlight on Immigration and Settlement. And we invite you all to stand by as we transition to the live Q&A session with our panelists. So if you haven't done so already, please submit your questions, and the CRDCN staff will help facilitate my facilitation of that session. Well, following that short CRDCN station break, we are now live and ready to extend our discussions across regions and across time zones in this fair country. This is your chance for engagement with our panelists and hopefully for some engagement among the panelists as well. And we have a lineup of some questions, but I do encourage you to add additional questions as we go through this. So let me, without any further ado, turn to our first question. And this is, I'll direct this at Tony, but I think others may want to add to it, but what are the best ways to encourage and or ensure that employers are forthcoming about attitudes towards hiring immigrants and international students? So best ways to ensure attitudes, for example, in employer surveys. So Tony, well,
okay, good. Yeah, so oftentimes, as scholars, we tend to do research in, dark office and without, engaging with the general public and employers and the policymakers and so on. But, in this particular area, immigration, which is very controversial and, but, also very important for Canada as an immigration country. So we have responded, right, to the changing attitudes and perceptions of the general public towards immigration, and also, towards employer, which is very important part of the policy-making process, who hires, immigrants and international students. As we know, economic integration is the most important part of the integration for immigrants, in addition to culture and social integration. So to do that, we have actually worked with our community partners, including the St. John's Board of Trade, the ACOVA, the federal government, and also provincial government, Newfoundland Workforce Innovation Center, to conduct a major survey of more than around 100, not 100,000 actually, employers in the region, and ask them this critical question about their perceptions of hiring immigrants, and also the attitudes towards immigrants. From that survey last year, actually, we have found that majority of the employers who have received applications from the immigrants and also international students reported positive impression, because their strong work ethic, because their reliability, and also because their high level productivity and performance. And we also found, very interestingly, those who actually hired immigrants reported more positive experience. Okay, and finally, we noticed that those employed in the rural, and remote areas of Atlantic Canada, and tend to report more acute labor skill shortages. But on the other hand, they don't have, more positive experience, in part because they don't have exposure to recent immigrants and international students. So from the policy perspective, we really need to, dispel all those kind of misperception against immigrants and international students. For example, there's common perception that newcomers take job away from locals. There's no evidence from our macroeconomic analysis using census data. And there's no adverse effect on unemployment rate to local workers. And also there's no evidence to suggest that immigrants are more likely to utilize Social Security benefits. In fact, anything they're actually less likely to utilize because they don't know how to apply. Okay. Also, they are more healthier because the screening process, and also because as immigrants, they pay almost tax immediately and only receive benefits late in their life. So basically, actually, immigrants have contributed to the physical health of Canada at both provincial and federal level. So basically, we need to work with our stakeholders and use our, survey evidence to convince general public that immigration actually is very important nation-building exercise for this wonderful country.
Thank you, Tony. Let me move on to a question. I think it's very much for you, Ima. Data released recently by StatsCan, such as the Labor Force Survey, includes summary analysis by immigrant groups. But the detailed data will only be available to researchers for analysis months or a year later. How do we encourage StatsCan to release the detailed data sooner so we can address the emerging issues ahead of the curve? Now, I know you're not StatsCan, but perhaps this is a good one for you to tackle.
Yes, so I'm not responding on behalf of StatsCan, but I think in general, the point and the key is the collaborative working relationship needs to start And I know CRDCN is doing a great job there. And I think there are opportunities to even have a closer working relationship where some of the context of the policy issues that we face on a daily basis discussed with researchers. Because I think bringing that to light will also bring out the rationale to have more disaggregated data available in a more timely fashion. A practical example of this was with COVID-19, where as COVID-19 measures came into place and people started being impacted in the workforce, we wanted to know more. As policymakers, we wanted to know more how we could support people in terms of communities that are being seriously impacted by COVID-19. So there were segments of the population, for example, that were hit by COVID and also hit by unemployment. So the question for us as policymakers is, how do we get to that information quickly enough at a disaggregated level with the right context that a researcher could bring to it? So, I mean, I totally understand and agree with your point, but I think the key to getting there is to work collaboratively with policymakers and with StatsCan to look for avenues and means for us to create a space to have that kind of conversation. So, I mean, I have worked in StatsCan. I worked in StatsCan for 5 years, and I have worked in many different line departments. And this issue is real in every department I've worked at. So I definitely think the opportunities to have the conversation. And I mean, as some people discussed earlier, like in Yoko's presentation, some of that work happened in terms of making IMDb data more granular. I was part of the project where we brought in a lot of additional variables into the IMDb. And that work, again, was driven by the collaborative efforts of researchers, StatsCan, and policymakers who basically wanted to know more about immigrants and their outcomes. So I think there is definitely the opportunity. And I think with conversation, we will get there. I'm confident.
Thank you, Ima. So moving on to a question for you, Anna. From one of our participants, they note you are also a research fellow in the UK and Germany, and you've co-authored a paper looking at Australia and the US. So the question is, how does Canada compare to other countries in terms of availability of administrative data for research? And what can we learn from the other countries?
Well, so Canada is maybe not up there in that sense in terms of the availability of data. Again, it has changed a lot from 20 years ago to what we are today, with more administrative data being available. It's still behind what can be done in certain Northern European countries, but it's similar to the level of access that you can get maybe in Australia, which has a system similar to the RDC, maybe with more remote or better remote access data to some of the surveys. But in general, there is still work to be done. And in particular, the access to administrative data is maybe we are a little bit behind. Also, if we compare with the UK and Germany, where I have the chance to listen to my colleagues and to know what type of data they do, they have excellent surveys that are very comprehensive in the sense that they are administrative data, but they are linked in ways that we are not linking them yet. So for instance, the UK has a way of linking the census so that you can actually build longitudinal sample using different census years, which is a feature that we don't have available here. And Germany has an amazing panel that has a myriad of information on different types of socio-demographic, and you can look at everything you want. And it's a panel that has been going on for so many years. So in that sense, in terms of maybe panel data, we are maybe a little bit behind because we don't have that opportunity to link data that provide us with panels. And the panels we have, they have been short-lived. Like the SLID was great, but the 6-year feature and the fact that it has been discontinued has actually halted all those that research. That's my impression. I think we are getting there, to tell you the truth, but there is still job to be done. As Ima was saying, the conversation has to keep going.
Thank you, Anna. And A question for Yoko. And in yesterday's CRDCN session, there was some interesting observations about the cultural barriers in building bridges between policy and research. And the term that was used was, there's a leap of faith is required on both the academic side, but also the policy receptor side. So based on your experience, what do you think CRDCN and its proposed incubator could actually do to facilitate bridging those, getting those leaps of faith actually in place and bridging?
Yeah, well, I think it takes it takes a lot of like time invested. I think that it takes a lot of like the channels of communication. I think it's the key. So like when you are trying to build the trust, and actually building the trust is the key to success of any kind of collaboration. And in order to build the trust, I think it takes time of like different moments to get together. So in a way, like perhaps, you know, one of the way that it worked for me to build a connection with the policymakers as well as the community groups or SPO sector was, especially in the immigration research field, is to have a lot of like repeated kind of interaction through the channels of conferences, etc. So in a way, I think for immigration research, we are very lucky to have multiple channels for the multiple stakeholders get together. So that through the venue of the Metropolis project or the Pathways to Prosperity, there are a lot of like linkages or the space to have the kind of interaction amongst the researchers and policymakers and then stakeholders get together. So if the RDC is to play a crucial role, is probably something to tap into the place or the space which already existed, and then kind of promote what are the data availability, and that actually unites to the researchers who haven't access to the RDC, but not well connected to the non-academic stakeholders. So I think that having those kind of cross-section, bring network into the existing channel would be a very fruitful venue to establish those kind of trust.
Thank you, Yoko. The next question is for Tony. COVID significantly changed the Canadian immigration flow and pattern. What are the pressing questions you would like to examine using RDC data? Tony, you're still muted.
Okay, thank you, Janet, for the question. And yeah, so definitely, you know, this is a phenomenon not only in Canada, but also in the US. You know, we know that COVID actually hit different group of population in a different fashion, and especially hit hardest to the recent immigrants, with minorities, and Aboriginal people, and people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And so in that, when we actually need to use the data to examine the pattern of differential effects to different group of people. For example, in Canada, we have the monthly labor force survey, which would allow us to look into the differential patterns of you know, job losses and you know, wage losses as a result of pandemic, and also differential pattern of recovery. Okay, slow or fast recovery for different group of workers. In the US, we have equivalent CPS. I mean, you know, just, you know, in terms of international collaboration, we have been talking with research partners in US, in Canada, in Australia, and, you know, try to paint a more or less consistent picture about the differential effects on, you know, different population group in a country. If we actually generate more or less convincing evidence, more consistent picture across countries, then, you know, we could actually have a powerful message to the policymakers, right, and also to the community stakeholders who actually could actually take concerted effort to support the most vulnerable group of the people in the country, including recent immigrants with minorities and so on and so forth. And in fact, actually, we recently had worked with St. John's Board of Trade and ANC Association for New Canadians and COVA, and develop a project examining very different kind of business responses to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the hiring practices, compensation, alternative work arrangement, for example, working from home, and also very different kind of recovery policies and effectiveness of those policies in order to help the stakeholders develop more knowledge related to COVID-19 and its impact, and also what would be the most effective responses and policy and programs to cope with the pandemic, and also future such external shocks that may actually come to us.
Thank you, Tony. Next, I will turn to you, back to you, Emma. You mentioned rigor in data analysis for policy. Can we balance the need for rigor with the need for early but imperfect data? Even if data is not perfect, release it early, fix it later when more information is available. Challenge.
That's a challenging question, and I mean, we faced it on a daily basis with, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. The challenge is that we live in a very short news cycle now, and part of the issue is we had so many people publishing data all over the place, and sometimes it was difficult to understand what was correct and what was wrong in some of the data being published all across the world and all over the place on the internet, on news and everything. So the challenge for us as a government of Canada is there's a level of trust that we need to maintain with our citizenry. So the question of balancing risk is something that we deal with on a daily basis. When is it right to be releasing data that we know is questionable? And when is it right to release data that has gone through the required rigor? And I would say it depends on a case-by-case basis. And right now, as Tony mentioned, in terms of really examining the impacts of COVID and ways to support our citizens across this country, the need for rigor is important, because from what we have found is that there are specific populations that were impacted. So how do you design policy that makes sense for some populations without really going through the required rigor? So, I mean, if you look at data in general, you know that there's a whole study going on about data ethics, data bias, and we have segments of the population that are not even represented in a lot of data. So how do you make conclusions about a given subpopulation when you don't even have the data? So you estimate, what are you estimating based on? So I think it's a question of risk. It's a question of also having the conversation with people with the required expertise before decisions are made about policy, because there are significant implications on some populations when decisions are made without balancing this risk. And it's an issue that's really seizing me as a chief data officer. I am seized by the constant need to balance that value versus the risk. And when is it right to go with innovative methods or estimation or apply a special technique to data versus taking time to really ensure that we're rigorously representing the right population in our analysis? So, I mean, my answer to that is that it's an ongoing conversation. There's no nirvana on it yet, but it's an issue that, I mean, I do not take lightly, because I work in a department where our mandate is to help Canadians and help people across this country, to help immigrants, to help new Canadians, and to help vulnerable groups. And I think it is extremely important that we're very deliberate in our choices about risk and balancing it as we make decisions.
Voice of experience there. Now our next question is from a delightful colleague of ours, Umit Kitzelton. And Umit writes, provinces, and this is probably, I'll direct this at you, Anna. Provinces hold very crucial policy relevant data, for example, health, K-12, housing, etc. IRCC has made significant progress by building data linkages with a select few provinces, which has been enabling invaluable research. What can CRDCN and StatsCan do to more systematically integrate provincial and federal immigration data?
I am not sure why are you directing this question to me. I wish they do whatever they have to.
What would you like?
No, yes. Sorry, it was a joke, but yes. So I know of these very successful collaborations. I think, in particular, I know that UBC is engaged in such collaboration in BC, and I think it's great. I also know that it took many, many years, because I've been hearing about this potential collaboration since I was in UBC almost 20 years ago, and it's now coming to an actual fruition. So it's a very long process, but it will be great, because that way, being able to integrate all these moving parts that come from different data sets, it actually provides us with the sort of context that we need to do research that is meaningful, that doesn't have the problems of missing a specific population or missing a specific issues that need to be addressed. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And I understand that you're going to have to leave us, and we're just coming up close to the end of the hour, but with the permission of my other panelists and our participants today, I'd like to just extend our discussion, perhaps for up to 15 minutes, just to get a few more of the questions on the table, and there's lots of those. So thank you, Anna, and whenever you need to leave, we'll bid you farewell and thank you.
Okay, so, and I will be available. I can answer if anyone wants to email to me. I will answer after.
Thank you so much. So our next question is an interesting one, and I think I'll throw it open to the panel. It's not clear to me exactly where the best direction would be, but one of our conference participants was excited to hear the fine level of detail which the immigration data sets are available through the RDCs. And he asks if any of you can speak to what the data may say around successful immigration patterns and practices in the most northern areas of our nation. So we're talking Northern Canada, immigration patterns. Who would like to leap in? This is not something any of you have been pursuing. Tony, have you any experience in this area?
You mean north, how we define, right? Canada is also a northern country, so right. So whole north we can go. So I mean, used to teach at University of Northern British Columbia. Northern BC, that's considered north. So to us, I mean, some part of Newfoundland Labrador is actually very north part of Canada. So we have done a little bit of research on the temporary foreign workers and also immigration to Labrador. I mean, this is the something that we don't have a lot of data. And but this is the issue about conducting this research in a remote rural area or small communities. Population small. If you look at those kind of StatsCan survey, right? You probably have issue about small sample size. So in lieu of those kind of official data sets, we actually conduct our own field research in those remote rural areas. And what we have found is that, there's a lot of kind of support from the local community, okay, in terms of attracting, retaining more immigrants, to those regions. And the issue here is that, a lot of time, because there's lack of infrastructure, lack of data set is part of that. Sometimes internet access, for example, if we take a flight from St. John's to Labrador, Happy Valley, Goose Bay, it would take less than an hour, but cost $1,000. So it's just to give you a sense about, the challenges, accessing those kind of remote rural community is real challenge. So, but that's the reason why, those employers in those regions experience a lot of serious labor skill shortages, okay? And, hard to find, qualified employees, hard to also retain them, in the region. So, so the issue here is that, we need to work together again. A lot of time is because, again, exposure issue I mentioned earlier. When employers or community people never seen immigrants in a lifetime, right? They are not comfortable in dealing with them. For example, I gave a public lecture in a beautiful place. I don't know if you have been to that, Fogo Island, and a group of people turn out. I mean, they are very interested people. A couple hundred people turn out to the community engagements about immigration, and I gave all this macroeconomic benefits of immigration in terms of population growth, economic growth, employment creation, productivity, and so on and so forth. And a lady stood up, said, Tony, this is all wonderful ideas, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. So the issue here is that, we need to have to make all this. Sometimes we have to reach out to those community to make sure they understand the needs for immigration and also the social economic benefits to the immigration. And also we need to balance the interest between, immigrant community from the employers and also from policymakers. And, this is one thing about the challenge of settling in those kind of remote northern community is lack of acyclical communities. And for example, you just don't have access to your social network, even your, the food ingredients, right? You don't have people to, look for help and so on and so forth. And so, we come up with this idea. I think Michael Ham at Western also mentioned that maybe we should consider, right, some kind of acyclic enclaves when we try to attract and retain those immigrants, newcomers into those communities. And actually, based on our research of recent Syrian refugees to Newfoundland and Labrador, and they're actually doing better in terms of retention, in terms of employment, and so on, so in terms of training, because they come in as a cohort, as a group. And, they have received a lot of mutual support and encouragement. So they are doing actually better.
Emma, did you want to add anything to this interesting discussion of the integration in northern communities of our immigrants?
I mean, I don't have much to add because I'm no longer coming from the immigration context, although I worked in immigration for almost 9 years. But definitely, I think Tony raises some good points. I think what would be interesting from an immigration perspective is to look at some of the settlement data. So I know when I worked in immigration, we had a whole database on settlement, like settlement of immigrants called iCare. So it might be interesting to take a look at some of that work linked to the IMDb to see what you can get about it. So I don't know if Yoko, you might have looked at that when you looked at the enhanced IMDb, but I think definitely to be of interest to see what's happening there, because anecdotally, I know that there's some movement of immigrants to some of the northern communities. But this is just based on anecdotal information. I haven't looked at it closely from an evidence-based point of view. So, I mean, Yoko, I'd be curious to know if you have any insight on that based on some of your work too.
Yoko.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm just starting to look into the ICARE data component, and then I think that there is, the pilot study, pilot project that was just, came out, I think, very recently through the RDC. So that with the ICARE data, we can look into the services that, the immigrants are subscribing from different types of services, settlement sector, and the language training or the trainings related to, occupation, like employment leading into the employment, etc. So yes, it is possible for us to now looking into more granular components of the settlement services and good practice. What leads to the better what kind of services leads to the specific employment and successful employment, as well as retention. And I think, yeah, so definitely the role that the settlement services have for maybe different for the better successful settlement could be different depending on the different regional settings, like urban area versus the smaller region versus remote area. And definitely those are the kind of things that we are very much interested in, and fingers crossed that we are trying to generate those information as we speak. And my colleague Michael Han is leading this project right now, and then we have researchers, young researchers, looking into this ICARE data right now.
And a logical next aspect to this discussion is, what is the best way to engage with Canadians to help them understand the benefits of immigration for us? And I would open that up to anyone who'd like to leap in before I engage in conscription. So how do we engage with Canadians? Best engage?
I mean, I can talk from my own personal opinion. I think we can engage by telling the story. So I know there's a lot of research that has been done in the past, a lot of research coming forward, but I think it would be important to bring that research to life in terms of storytelling in language and in context that people understand and can relate to. That would be important, because one of my concerns through the years is, as we look at data and we do analysis, sometimes we look at populations as a monolith. And the challenge with looking at populations as a monolith is that you form a narrative around a monolith. But I think what would be interesting is if we start dissecting some of those stories based on some of the granular data we're able to use now, and tell real stories. Like it could be a very simple short story about the pathway of an immigrant and the outcomes. So people start to understand and relate to some of the experiences that they go through. And I think with the wealth of data now available through immigration, like the IMDb, the linkages that have been done with ICARE, with the census data, there are definitely a lot of opportunities. And what would be interesting is to work with the department and see how, from a comms perspective, some of those stories can be told in a way that people understand. So basically, it's like moving from the research into a more communications piece, and people relate to how this person came in, the outcomes, the benefits. And I think it becomes more real when people can actually relate to the story, as opposed to it being a study that just published. And I know publishing those papers are extremely important. But I think there's also like some high value we can get out of telling the story also in a more comms piece type of way. So that's my view on that.
This resonates very much with me. When I did work with SHRC for a number of years, and one of the things that they've done, I think very successfully, has been to celebrate, reward, and encourage storytelling. And that, I think, is as enormously important for reaching out. So thank you. So we move on, and we're going to be looking for fairly short answers to the next questions. Yoko, how are you finding the level of access to immigration data in the current pandemic environment?
Yes, definitely it is a challenge. Depending on which RDC you are at, the levels of, the COVID impact is very different. And then as far as I'm understanding, depending on different RDC, they have a different, the procedure being taken. So I'm affiliated with the RDC at Western and an RDC at the Atlantic Research Data Center at in Halifax. I can see that the different tempo in terms of accessibility to the center. So for example, at Western right now, like we have a sign up sheet, and then the seats are reduced to the half level to ensure the social distancing within the RDC. So every second computer booth is being closed, but then we can still sign up and then work in the data set. So that started, I think, for 2 months. So I think it is a kind of challenging, but then it's still doable. Whereas other centers may be still working on the reduced hours, etc. So definitely, it is accessibility is an issue for us researchers to produce our research, but also for the students to produce the research for their dissertation and then their MA project. Those are more sensitive issues. So it is kind of difficult. So hopefully, the alternative way being able to access to those confidential data is coming up on their way in the near future. And then COVID might be serving to a bit of, for good for, facilitating that process a little quicker. But that's my wishful thought. So yes, definitely that's a tricky situation. But I think we are making what we can do based on the with striking a good balance.
The art of possible and the appropriate. So Ima, I wonder if you would be good enough to close out our session with a few more words about the challenges and opportunities for the federal and provincial governments to work together to improve their administrative data sources and link their data sets.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think the journey began long ago. So thank you to those who came before us, who thought that this was important to do, and they began the journey. And some of us joined the journey, and we're still on that path. And we look forward to more collaborative relationships. And I think it is important. It is like, if it were important last year, it is even more important today for us to really work together from academic standpoint, from provincial standpoint, from municipality standpoint, to look at how we can standardize some of our data. Because COVID-19 taught us that we all had data. So all of us had data all over the place. But it was a challenge bringing that data together. It was a challenge contextualizing that data. There are people across the country that need help. And when it becomes difficult to react because we don't have the evidence base to pinpoint on certain populations and help them in a quick way, it becomes a challenge. So I think the imperative is there. The conversation is needed in terms of how we can not only just look at reporting or research, but building that, the resilient foundation for data, so that as we move forward into the future, it will be easier for us to really have the ability to do research and shorten that timeline between research analysis and then practicing, because that still remains a huge gap. And I know it has been a gap since the 80s. And it's still a gap today. I mean, though we're shortening it, like Yoko was able to describe some of the work she's done with the IMDb, but there's definitely opportunity to bring in more partnerships into this. So working with CRDCN, I really look forward to that opportunity where we can sit down and chunk out some of the pieces that we can tackle together to really push forward on building, not just building the evidence base, but being able to act on it. Because I think action is extremely important, and people across this country need our help. And with the right level of analysis and evidence base, I am confident that we will get there eventually. But like I said, it's a journey, and extremely excited to be on this journey with everybody. And thanks to my fellow panelists, because I am extremely impressed by your work, and let's keep it going.
Excellent. So thank you, Emma, and it's a great place to stop this session, but I do want to thank all of our distinguished panelists, Yoko, Tony, Anna, and Emma. Also thank our CRDCN colleagues who have been so effective in putting this together, and I know it's a huge amount of work. Great series of questions and discussion. So this has been the third thematic session of our celebration type conference following the kickoff session last week. And I want to invite you now to join us for our next session in this fascinating series of discussions. And tomorrow's is at the same time, the same place. It's a spotlight on population health and health services. So thank you all.